The box slipped from my hands, crashing to the floor and shattering the fragile piece of our new home. I froze, waiting for the inevitable. "Sarah?" Helen's shrill voice pierced the air. "What on earth are you doing up there?" I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and plastered on a smile before descending the stairs. "I'm so sorry, Helen. It was an accident. I'll clean it up right away." My mother-in-law stood at the bottom of the staircase, arms crossed, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Honestly, Sarah, you'd think you'd be more careful with our things. This isn't some college dorm room, you know." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that this was temporary. Adam and I just needed to save up enough for our own place. Then we'd be free. Speaking of Adam, where was he? My husband had conveniently disappeared the moment we'd arrived at his parents' house this morning. "Where's Adam?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Helen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, his father needed help with something in the garage. You know how men are with their projects." I did know. It was amazing how many projects Adam managed to find whenever there was actual work to be done. "Well, I'd better get that mess cleaned up," I said, turning to head back upstairs. Helen's voice stopped me. "Wait just a minute, Sarah. While you're up there, you might as well start unpacking your things. I've cleared out some space in the guest room closet for you and Adam." I blinked in surprise. The guest room? But I thought we'd be staying in Adam's old room. Helen's laugh was like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, honey, that room is much too small for 2 people. Besides, I use it as my sewing room now. The guest room will be much more comfortable for you both." I opened my mouth to argue, but thought better of it. This was Helen's house, after all. "Of course," I said instead. "Thank you for your hospitality." As I climbed the stairs, I could hear Helen muttering something about ungrateful children and "in my day." I gritted my teeth and kept moving. The guest room was small and stuffy, with floral wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. A narrow double bed took up most of the space, leaving barely enough room for our suitcases. I sighed and started picking up the shards of the broken vase, careful not to cut myself. As I worked, I heard the front door open and Adam's voice drift up the stairs. "Mom? Sarah? I'm back!" "In here, sweetie," Helen called out. "Your wife had a little accident with one of my vases. Why don't you go help her clean up?" I rolled my eyes. Of course, she'd throw me under the bus. Adam appeared in the doorway, looking sheepish. "Hey, babe, need a hand?" I looked up at him, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Where have you been?" He shrugged. "Dad needed help with the lawnmower. You know how it is." "Right," I said, turning back to my task. "Well, since you're here, you can start unpacking. Your mom says we're staying in the guest room." Adam's brow furrowed. "The guest room? But I thought—" "Your old room is her sewing room now, apparently," I cut him off. "Oh," he said, looking uncomfortable. "Well, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's just temporary, right?" I stood up, dumping the broken pieces into the trash. "Right, temporary." As I brushed past him to wash my hands, Adam caught my arm. "Hey," he said softly. "I know this isn't ideal, but we'll make it work. I promise." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I looked into his eyes, all I could see was the same weakness that had led us here in the first place. The sound of Helen calling us down to dinner broke the moment. Adam squeezed my hand and headed downstairs, leaving me alone in the tiny room that was supposed to be our new home. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was sure to be a long and trying evening. As I reached for the doorknob, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired, defeated. "Come on, Sarah," I whispered to myself. "You can do this. It's just temporary." But even as I said the words, a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What if it's not?" The world came into focus slowly, like an old television warming up. Harsh, fluorescent lights burned my eyes, and the antiseptic smell of a hospital filled my nostrils. I blinked, trying to make sense of my surroundings. "Sarah, can you hear me?" A man's voice, unfamiliar yet tinged with concern. I turned my head, wincing at the dull ache. A doctor stood beside my bed, clipboard in hand. Behind him I could see my parents, James and Elizabeth, their faces etched with worry. "What happened?" I croaked, my throat dry and scratchy. The doctor leaned in. "You fainted at home and hit your head. Your mother-in-law called an ambulance." "Mother-in-law?" I frowned, searching my memory. Nothing. "Sarah," my mom said, stepping forward. How are you feeling, sweetheart? I managed a weak smile. Confused. What day is it? It's Tuesday, my dad answered. You've been out for about 6 hours. Tuesday. Okay, that made sense. I remembered going to work on Monday, but after that, nothing. Where's Adam? I asked, the name coming to me suddenly. My husband. But when I tried to picture his face, my mind drew a blank. My parents exchanged a glance. He's in the waiting room with Helen, my mom said carefully. Do you want us to get them? Helen, another name without a face. I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. I can't remember them. Mom, Dad, what's happening to me? The doctor stepped in, his voice calm and reassuring. Sarah, I believe you're experiencing a form of psychogenic amnesia. It's often triggered by stress or traumatic events. Your memory loss seems to be specific to your husband and mother-in-law. Can you tell me the last thing you remember clearly? I closed my eyes, concentrating. Work. I remember being at work on Monday. After that, it's fuzzy. Interesting, the doctor murmured, making a note on his clipboard. Sarah, I'd like to run a few more tests if that's all right with you. I nodded, still trying to process what was happening. As the doctor left to arrange the tests, my parents moved closer to the bed. Honey, my dad said, his voice low, is there anything you want to tell us? Anything that might have caused this stress? I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? My mom took my hand, her eyes searching mine. Sarah, we've been worried about you. Ever since you moved in with Adam and Helen, you've seemed different, withdrawn. We thought maybe it was just the adjustment period, but now... Her words trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. I shook my head, frustrated by the gaps in my memory. I don't know. I can't remember. Just then, a commotion in the hallway caught our attention. A man's voice, angry and insistent, grew louder as it approached my room. I don't care what the doctor said. That's my wife in there, and I have a right to see her. The door burst open, and a man I didn't recognize stormed in, followed closely by an older woman. They both stopped short when they saw me, their expressions a mix of relief and something else I couldn't quite place. Sarah, the man said, moving towards the bed. Thank God you're awake. We've been so worried. I recoiled instinctively, pressing myself back against the pillows. Who are you? The man's face fell, hurt and confusion flashing in his eyes. Sarah, it's me, Adam, your husband. The older woman stepped forward, her lips pursed. And I'm Helen, your mother-in-law. Surely you remember us? I looked from one to the other, searching for any spark of recognition. Nothing, just a vague sense of unease that I couldn't explain. I'm sorry, I whispered. I can't remember you. Adam reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Something in his touch felt wrong, almost threatening. He frowned, exchanging a loaded glance with Helen. It's okay, sweetheart, Helen said, her voice sickly sweet. We'll help you remember. Once you're home with us, I'm sure everything will come back to you. A chill ran down my spine at her words. Home with them? The very thought filled me with a nameless dread. I looked to my parents, silently pleading for help. My dad stepped forward, placing himself between me and the strangers who claimed to be my family. I think, he said firmly, that Sarah needs some rest. Perhaps it would be best if you came back later. Adam opened his mouth to argue, but Helen placed a hand on his arm. Of course, she said smoothly. We'll be back tomorrow, Sarah. Don't worry about a thing. As they left the room, I caught a glimpse of Adam's face. The look in his eyes sent a shiver through me. It wasn't love or concern I saw there. It was anger. And beneath that, something darker still. The hospital room felt like a sanctuary as I recovered. My parents a constant, comforting presence. But the peace couldn't last forever. After 3 days, the doctors declared me fit to go home. The question was, where exactly was home? You're coming with us, sweetheart, Mom said firmly as she helped me pack. Until you get your memories back, you need to be somewhere safe and familiar. I nodded, relief washing over me. The thought of going back to a house I couldn't remember, with people who felt like strangers, terrified me. As we prepared to leave, Adam and Helen arrived. The sight of them still sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. Sarah, darling, Helen cooed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We've come to take you home. I instinctively stepped closer to my father. Actually, I'm going to stay with my parents for a while. Adam's face darkened. That's ridiculous. You belong with us, your family. We are her family, Dad interjected, his voice steely. And right now, this is what Sarah needs. The tension in the room was palpable. Adam opened his mouth to argue, but Helen laid a hand on his arm. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We understand. But we'll be visiting every day, won't we, Adam? To help jog your memory." Something in her tone made me shudder. As they left, I caught a glimpse of Adam's face. The look he gave me was one of pure, cold fury. Back at my parents' house, I sank into the familiar comfort of my childhood bedroom. But even here, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Mom, Dad," I said over dinner that night, "I need to know the truth. What was my life like with Adam and Helen?" They exchanged a worried glance. "Honey," Mom began carefully, "we don't want to influence your memories. The doctor said—" "Please," I interrupted, "I need to know." Dad sighed heavily. "We were worried about you, Sarah. You seemed different, withdrawn. When we'd visit, Helen was always hovering, and Adam, well, he didn't seem like the man you married." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" "He was controlling," Mom said softly. "Always speaking for you, making decisions. And Helen, she treated you more like a servant than a daughter-in-law." The words hit me like a physical blow. Flashes of memory started to surface. Helen's critical voice, Adam's tight grip on my arm, the constant feeling of walking on eggshells. "I need to know more," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to remember." Dad leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, we have an idea. It's risky, but it might help us uncover the truth." He explained their plan, to secretly record Adam and Helen's conversations when they visited. It was a violation of privacy, possibly even illegal, but at that moment, I didn't care. "Let's do it," I said firmly. The next day, when Adam and Helen arrived, we were ready. Tiny microphones hidden throughout the living room captured every word. I played my part, feigning confusion and vulnerability. "I'm trying to remember," I said, my voice deliberately weak, "but everything's still so fuzzy." Helen patted my hand, her nails digging in slightly. "Don't worry, dear, we'll have you back home soon enough." "Yes," Adam added, his voice low and intense. "Where you belong." As they left, I caught Helen whispering to Adam, "We need to get her back quickly, before she remembers too much." That night, we gathered around the kitchen table to listen to the recordings. My hands shook as Dad pressed play. Helen's voice, sharp and clear. "We need to be careful. If she remembers how we treated her—" Adam, angry. "She won't, and if she does, we'll make sure she knows her place." I listened, horror growing with each word. The casual cruelty, the plans to isolate me further, the thinly veiled threats, it was all there. As the recording ended, I looked up at my parents, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, God," I whispered. "What do I do now?" Dad's expression was grim. "We fight back. It's time to show Adam and Helen that they can't control you anymore." In that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear and confusion gave way to a burning anger. I nodded, my jaw set. "You're right," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in days. "It's time to take back my life." The next morning, I woke with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in years. The recordings had confirmed my worst fears, but they'd also ignited a fire within me. I was done being a victim. "I want to go back," I announced over breakfast. Mom nearly choked on her coffee. "What, Sarah, you can't be serious." "I am," I said firmly. "We need more evidence." And I hesitated, then plunged on. "I need to face them, to remember everything." Dad's face was grim. "It's dangerous, sweetheart. What if they suspect something?" I squared my shoulders. "Then I'll deal with it, but I can't hide forever." After hours of debate and careful planning, we agreed. I'd return to Adam and Helen's house, wearing a hidden microphone. At the first sign of trouble, I'd use a code word, and my parents would come immediately. As we pulled up to the house, my supposed home, my heart raced. Adam and Helen were waiting on the porch, all smiles and false warmth. "Sarah, darling," Helen exclaimed, enveloping me in a suffocating hug. "We've missed you so much." Adam's embrace was stiff, his eyes cold despite his smile. "Welcome home, honey." I forced myself to smile back, fighting the urge to run. "Thank you. I'm glad to be back." The next few hours were a masterclass in gaslighting. Helen fussed over me, her saccharine concern barely masking her impatience. Adam hovered nearby, his presence a constant unspoken threat. "You must be exhausted, dear," Helen said, steering me towards the stairs. "Why don't you lie down for a bit? I'll bring you some tea." I nodded, grateful for the chance to be alone. But as I reached the top of the stairs, a wave of dizziness hit me. Memories flooded back, Helen's shrill voice berating me, Adam's iron grip on my arm as he dragged me up these very steps. I stumbled, catching myself on the railing. Adam was beside me in an instant, his hand on my back feeling more like a shove than support. "Careful, honey," he said, his voice low. "We wouldn't want you to have another accident." The threat in his tone was unmistakable. I shuddered, suddenly certain that my fainting spell hadn't been an accident at all. In the guest room, our room, I reminded myself, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The walls seemed to close in around me, years of suppressed memories threatening to overwhelm me. A soft knock at the door made me jump. Helen entered, carrying a steaming cup of tea. "Here you are, dear," she said, handing me the cup. "This should help you relax." I took a small sip, more out of politeness than thirst. The tea had an odd, bitter aftertaste that set alarm bells ringing in my head. "Thank you," I managed, setting the cup aside. "I think I'll try to sleep now." Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Sweet dreams, Sarah." As soon as the door closed behind her, I dumped the tea into a potted plant. Whatever was in that drink, I was certain it wasn't meant to help me. I lay down, pretending to sleep, straining my ears for any sound. After what felt like hours, I heard hushed voices in the hallway. "She's out cold," Helen whispered. The sedative worked quickly. "Good," Adam replied. "Now we can discuss how to handle this situation. We can't risk her remembering anything else." My blood ran cold. They had drugged me, and from the sound of it, they were planning something far worse. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I typed out a message to my parents. "Code red. Come now." As I hit send, the bedroom door creaked open. I quickly closed my eyes, feigning sleep, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Poor, confused Sarah." Helen's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Don't worry, dear. We'll make sure you never have to worry about remembering again." In that moment, I knew I had to act. Whatever they had planned, I couldn't wait for rescue. It was time to save myself. My heart pounded as I lay there, feigning sleep, while Adam and Helen whispered just outside the door. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to remain still, listening intently. "We need to move quickly," Adam muttered. "Her parents are getting suspicious. If they start digging—" Helen's voice was cold and calculating. "Don't worry, I have a plan. We'll make it look like an accident." Poor, confused Sarah, still dizzy from her fall. I suppressed a gasp. They were planning to kill me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly the full weight of my situation crashed down upon me. This wasn't just about emotional abuse or control anymore. My life was in danger. As their footsteps retreated down the hall, I cautiously opened my eyes. The room spun slightly. Whatever they'd put in that tea was strong. But I couldn't afford to be weak now. I had to get out. Slowly, carefully, I eased myself off the bed. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to stand. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and peered out into the hallway, empty. I made my way down the stairs, clinging to the railing for support. As I reached the bottom, a cacophony of memories assaulted me. Helen's shrill voice berating me for every perceived slight. Adam's tight grip on my arm as he dragged me from room to room. The constant feeling of worthlessness and fear that had become my daily existence. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. There would be time for that later. Right now, I needed to focus on survival. I was halfway to the front door when I heard them coming. Panic surged through me as I looked around frantically for a hiding place. The coat closet, it was my only option. I dove inside, pulling the door closed just as Adam and Helen entered the foyer. "I'll check upstairs," Adam said. "You look down here." My breath caught in my throat as Helen's footsteps approached the closet. I pressed myself against the wall, praying she wouldn't open the door. "Sarah?" Helen called out, her voice sickly sweet. "Where are you, dear? We're worried about you." The doorknob turned, and I braced myself for discovery. But at that moment, a loud crash came from upstairs. "Helen!" Adam shouted. "She's not here." Helen cursed under her breath and hurried away. I allowed myself a moment of relief before reality set in. They knew I was gone. I had to move now. I burst out of the closet and ran for the door, fumbling with the lock. Just as I got it open, a hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. Adam's face was contorted with rage. "Where do you think you're going?" I didn't think. I just reacted. My knee came up hard, connecting with his groin. As he doubled over in pain, I shoved him aside and bolted out the door. The cool night air hit my face as I ran down the driveway. I could hear Helen screaming behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, my bare feet slapping against the pavement, my lungs burning with each breath. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street. Gasping for air, I finally allowed myself to look back. The house loomed in the distance, dark and menacing, but there was no sign of Adam or Helen pursuing me. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, dialing my parents' number. "Dad," I choked out when he answered. "I need help. Please come get me." As I waited for my parents to arrive, huddled in the shadows of a neighbor's hedge, the full impact of what had happened hit me. The life I thought I knew was a lie. My husband and mother-in-law had not only abused me but had been planning to kill me. Tears streamed down my face, a mix of fear, relief, and overwhelming grief. But beneath it all, a steely resolve was forming. I had escaped, but this wasn't over. Adam and Helen needed to pay for what they'd done. As my parents' car pulled up, I made a decision. I would not be a victim anymore. It was time to fight back, to reclaim my life, and ensure that Adam and Helen could never hurt anyone else again. With renewed determination, I stood up, ready to face whatever came next. The battle for my freedom and my life had only just begun. The law office felt like a fortress, a sanctuary from the storm raging outside. I sat across from Linda Pearson, the divorce attorney my parents had recommended, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. "Sarah," Linda said, her voice gentle but firm, "I want you to understand that what we're about to do won't be easy. Adam and Helen won't go down without a fight." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, but I can't let them win, not after everything they've done." Linda spread out the documents before me, police reports, medical records, and transcripts of the recordings we'd made. Seeing it all laid out like this, the full extent of the abuse I'd endured hit me anew. "We have a strong case," Linda assured me. "The evidence of emotional and physical abuse is overwhelming. And with the attempted drugging and, well, what sounds like a murder plot, we can push for criminal charges as well." My stomach churned at her words. It still seemed surreal that my own husband had been planning to kill me, but the fear that gripped me was all too real. "What if they come after me?" I whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted me since my escape. Linda's eyes hardened. "That's why we're filing for an emergency restraining order along with the divorce papers. They won't be able to come near you without facing serious consequences." As I signed paper after paper, a mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, fear, anger, and a glimmer of hope. This was it. I was finally taking back control of my life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, therapy sessions, and sleepless nights. Adam and Helen, true to form, fought the divorce with everything they had. They denied all allegations, painting me as mentally unstable and ungrateful. But I refused to back down. With each deposition, each piece of evidence presented, I grew stronger. The recordings we'd made were damning, and several neighbors came forward with accounts of hearing arguments and seeing bruises on me. Then, just as it seemed we were making progress, disaster struck. I was leaving my therapist's office when I saw him, Adam, leaning against my car, his face a mask of false concern. "Sarah," he called out, taking a step towards me. "Please, we need to talk. This has all gotten out of hand." I froze, my heart pounding. He wasn't supposed to be here. The restraining order. "Stay back," I warned, fumbling for my phone. "I'm calling the police." Adam's face darkened. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled, lunging forward. I turned to run, but he caught my arm, spinning me around. The familiar fear threatened to paralyze me, but something inside me snapped. I was done being a victim. With all my strength, I shoved him away. "No," I shouted, my voice echoing in the parking lot. "You don't get to control me anymore." Adam stumbled back, shock written across his face. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other. Then the sound of sirens broke the silence. As the police car pulled into the lot, Adam's expression changed from shock to fury. "This isn't over," he hissed before turning and running. I collapsed against my car, shaking uncontrollably as the officers approached. In the chaos that followed, giving statements, calling Linda and my parents, one thought kept running through my mind. Adam was right. This wasn't over. That night, as I lay in bed at my parents' house, surrounded by the comfort of my childhood room, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Adam's words echoed in my mind, a sinister promise of things to come. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. With trembling fingers, I opened it. "You can't hide forever, Sarah. One way or another, I'll make you pay for this." I stared at the screen, a cold fear gripping my heart. Adam had found a way around the restraining order, a way to reach me. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that he wouldn't stop until he had his revenge. As I called the police to report the threat, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. The divorce, the legal proceedings, they were just the opening salvo. The true test of my strength and resilience lay ahead. Tomorrow, I would face Adam and Helen in court for the first time since filing for divorce. And I knew, deep in my bones, that it would be the fight of my life. The courthouse loomed before me, its stone facade a silent witness to countless battles. Today, it would bear witness to mine. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I climbed the steps, my parents and Linda flanking me like protective sentries. "Remember," Linda whispered as we approached the courtroom, "stay calm. No matter what they say, we have the truth on our side." I nodded, squaring my shoulders. The truth. It had become my armor, my weapon against the lies that had imprisoned me for so long. As we entered the courtroom, I saw them. Adam and Helen, sitting with their lawyer, looking every inch the concerned husband and mother-in-law. The sight of them made my stomach churn, but I refused to let them see my fear. The judge called the court to order, and the battle began. Adam's lawyer painted a picture of me as an unstable, ungrateful wife, twisting my amnesia into a sign of mental instability. Helen dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, the perfect image of a distraught mother. But then it was our turn. Linda presented the evidence methodically, relentlessly, the recordings, the medical reports, the testimonies from neighbors and co-workers. With each piece of evidence, I could see Adam and Helen's facades cracking. When it was time for me to testify, I felt a sudden calm wash over me. This was my moment to reclaim my voice, my truth. "Sarah," Linda began, "can you tell the court about your life with Adam and Helen?" I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them everything. The constant criticism, the isolation, the fear that had become my constant companion. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of those years lifting from my shoulders. "And the night you left," Linda prompted. "What happened?" I recounted that terrifying night, my voice growing stronger with each word. "They drugged me," I said, looking directly at Adam and Helen. "And I heard them planning to make my death look like an accident." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Adam's face contorted with rage, while Helen's mask of concern slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. As I finished my testimony, Adam suddenly leapt to his feet. "She's lying," he shouted, his face red with fury. "You ungrateful bitch, after everything we've done for you." The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but Adam was beyond control. He lunged towards me, his eyes wild with hatred. Everything seemed to slow down. I saw the bailiff moving to intercept Adam, my father rising from his seat, Linda's hand on my arm. But in that moment I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, meeting Adam's gaze without fear. "No more," I said, my voice ringing clear through the chaos. "You don't control me anymore." Adam froze, shock replacing the rage in his eyes. In that moment I saw him for what he truly was, a small, pathetic man whose power existed only through fear and manipulation. The bailiff restrained Adam, and the judge called for a recess. As Adam was led away, still shouting threats, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm I had feared for so long had finally broken, and I was still standing. During the recess, Linda pulled me aside, her face grave. "Sarah, Adam's outburst might have just won our case, but it's also made him more dangerous. We need to be prepared for anything." I nodded, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about winning in court anymore. It was about survival. As we prepared to re-enter the courtroom, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This isn't over. One way or another, you'll pay." I showed the message to Linda and my parents. Their faces paled, but I felt a steely resolve settle over me. Adam was right about one thing. This wasn't over. But I was done being the victim in this story. "Let's finish this," I said, squaring my shoulders and pushing open the courtroom doors. As I walked back to the stand, I could feel Adam's eyes boring into me, promising retribution. But for the first time, his gaze didn't fill me with fear. Instead, I felt a fierce determination. Whatever came next, whatever Adam had planned, I would face it. Because I had finally found something stronger than fear, the power of my own voice and the truth it carried. The judge called the court back to order, and I took my seat, ready for whatever came next. The final battle was about to begin, and this time I intended to win. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, its contents carrying the weight of my past and the promise of my future. I took a deep breath and opened it, my eyes scanning the official document inside. Divorce granted. It was over. A wave of emotions washed over me, relief, joy, and a hint of sadness for the life I'd once dreamed of. But mostly, I felt free. "Sarah," my mom's voice called from downstairs, "there's someone here to see you." Curious, I made my way down, the divorce papers still clutched in my hand. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. Helen stood in the entryway looking smaller and older than I remembered. "Hello, Sarah," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. I came to apologize." For a moment I couldn't speak. After everything that had happened, all the pain and fear, here she was, standing in my parents' house. "Why now?" I finally managed to ask. Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I've lost everything. Adam, he's in jail. The truth about what we did to you, it destroyed our family. And I realized too late that I was the architect of that destruction." I listened as Helen poured out her regrets, her realization of the toxic environment she'd created, the way she'd enabled and encouraged Adam's abuse. It was surreal, hearing the woman who had tormented me for years admit to her wrongs. When she finished, silence hung between us. I thought about all the times I dreamed of this moment, imagined what I'd say if Helen ever apologized, but now, faced with the reality, I felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just a calm certainty. "Thank you for your apology, Helen," I said, my voice steady. "I hope you find peace, but I can't be part of your journey to find it. Goodbye." As I closed the door behind her, I felt the last chains of my past fall away. I was truly free now, not just legally, but emotionally. The next few months were a whirlwind of change and growth. I reconnected with old friends, started traveling, and discovered new passions I'd never had the freedom to explore before. With each new experience, I felt myself growing stronger, more confident. But something was still missing. I found myself thinking about other women who might be trapped in situations like mine, feeling alone and helpless. That's when I decided to start the support group. Our first meeting was small, just 5 women gathered in a community center room. As I shared my story, I saw recognition and hope dawn in their eyes. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone. Week by week, our group grew. Women from all walks of life, each with their own story of survival. Together, we laughed, cried, and slowly, steadily began to heal. One evening, as I was locking up after a particularly powerful session, a young woman approached me. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a determined set to her jaw. "I'm leaving him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After hearing your story, I know I can do it. Thank you for showing me it's possible." In that moment, I felt a warmth spread through my chest. This was why I'd survived, why I'd fought so hard. Not just for myself, but for her, and for all the others who needed to know they weren't alone. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the fear, the moments of despair, but also the strength I'd found, the support I'd received, and the new purpose I'd discovered. I pulled into my driveway, my own home, bought with my own money, filled with my own choices. As I stepped inside, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was strong, confident, and free. I smiled at my reflection, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over me. My past no longer defined me. I had reclaimed my identity, my voice, my life. And now I was using that voice to help others do the same. This wasn't just a new chapter in my life. It was a whole new book, and I was the author. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had the strength to face them, because I had faced my darkest fears and emerged victorious. As I settled into my favorite chair, I opened my laptop and began to type. "My name is Sarah," I wrote, "and this is my story of survival, hope, and the power of finding your own voice." The cursor blinked, waiting for the words to flow, and flow they did, carrying with them the promise of healing, not just for me, but for all those who would read them, and find the courage to write their own new beginnings. The room spun like a carnival ride gone wrong. I clutched the kitchen counter, my knuckles white as the familiar dizziness threatened to overwhelm me. Not again, not now. "Scott?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, heavy footsteps from upstairs. My husband appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of irritation rather than concern. "What is it now, Lena?" he sighed, not moving to help me. I swallowed hard, fighting the nausea. "I think I'm going to faint. Can you just help me to the couch?" Scott rolled his eyes, but crossed the room, roughly grabbing my arm. "This is getting old, you know. Have you even been to the doctor like I told you to?" As he half-dragged me to the living room, I bit back a retort. Of course I had been to the doctor, multiple times, but no one could figure out what was wrong with me. The dizziness, the fatigue, the unexplained pain, it was all a mystery. He dumped me unceremoniously onto the couch and stood there, arms crossed. "I have a meeting in an hour. Are you going to be okay? Or do I need to cancel?" I looked up at him, searching for any hint of the man I'd married 10 years ago. The Scott who would have dropped everything to take care of me. The Scott who loved me. "I'll be fine," I lied, closing my eyes against another wave of dizziness. "Go to your meeting." "Great," he said, already turning away. "There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you get hungry later." As the front door slammed behind him, I let out a shaky breath. When had things gotten so bad between us? I thought back to our early days. The romantic gestures, the laughter, the way he'd look at me like I was the only woman in the world. Now, I was lucky if he looked at me at all. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. With shaking hands, I reached for it, hoping it wasn't work calling to ask why I hadn't shown up yet. It was a text from my father-in-law, Frank. "Hey, sweetie, just checking in. How are you feeling today?" I smiled weakly. At least someone cared. "Not great," I typed back. "Another dizzy spell. Scott's gone to a meeting." Frank's response was almost immediate. "Want me to come over? I can bring soup." Tears pricked at my eyes. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." As I waited for Frank to arrive, I couldn't help but wonder what Scott's mother, Beth, would think if she could see us now. She had been so warm, so loving, the complete opposite of her son. Her death 5 years ago had hit us all hard, but sometimes I felt like I was the only one who still mourned her. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. "It's open, Frank," I called out. He entered, a thermos of soup in one hand and a concerned smile on his face. "Oh, Lena," he said, taking in my pale complexion. "You look awful, sweetheart." "Thanks," I said dryly, managing a weak laugh. As Frank busied himself in the kitchen, heating up the soup, I closed my eyes again. The dizziness was subsiding, but a nagging thought remained. Why hadn't Scott told his father he was going to a meeting? And why did Frank seem surprised to find me alone? "Here we go," Frank said, returning with a steaming bowl. "Chicken noodle, Beth's recipe. It'll fix you right up." I took a small sip, savoring the familiar taste. "Frank," I said hesitantly, "did Scott tell you he had a meeting today?" Frank's brow furrowed. "No, he didn't mention anything." "Why?" I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing unease. "No reason. I'm sure he just forgot." But as I ate my soup, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder, what if my illness wasn't the only thing threatening to tear my marriage apart? The next morning I woke to an empty bed and a pounding headache. Scott's side hadn't been slept in. Again. I reached for my phone, squinting at the bright screen. No messages, no missed calls, nothing. I dragged myself out of bed, ignoring the wave of dizziness that threatened to send me back down. As I made my way to the kitchen, I heard the front door open. "Scott?" I called out. He appeared in the doorway, looking disheveled and smelling faintly of alcohol. "Oh, you're up," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Work thing," he mumbled, heading for the stairs. "Crashed at Dave's. Going to shower." Before I could respond, he was gone. I stood there, my hands shaking as I gripped the kitchen counter. Work thing? On a Tuesday night? And since when did he stay at Dave's without letting me know? The lies were piling up, each one more transparent than the last. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was very wrong with my marriage. I pulled out my laptop, determination overriding my physical discomfort. If Scott wasn't going to be honest with me, I'd find the truth myself. Hours passed as I combed through our joint bank statements, Scott's email, he'd never been good with passwords, and his social media accounts. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I noticed a pattern. Every other Friday there was a charge at a high-end restaurant downtown, a restaurant Scott had never mentioned going to, and always for two. My heart raced as I dug deeper. There were Uber receipts to and from an unfamiliar address, hotel charges in cities where Scott claimed to be at conferences, and buried in his email drafts I found messages to someone named Maggie, intimate messages, loving messages, messages that should have been for me. I was so engrossed in my discovery that I didn't hear Scott come back downstairs. His voice made me jump. "What are you doing?" I slammed the laptop shut, my cheeks burning with a mix of shame and anger. "Nothing," I lied, hating how easily it came. "Just work stuff." Scott's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. "I'm heading out again. Don't wait up." As he turned to leave, something inside me snapped. "Are you seeing someone else?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. Scott froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" he said, his voice dangerously low. I stood up, ignoring the trembling in my legs. "You heard me. Are you cheating on me, Scott?" He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of anger and... "Was that guilt? You're being ridiculous, Lena. Is this because of your... condition? Are you not thinking straight?" The casual dismissal of my illness stung, but I pressed on. "Don't turn this around on me. Answer the question." Scott's jaw clenched. "I don't have time for this. I have a life outside of babysitting you, you know." "Babysitting me?" I echoed, incredulous. "Is that what you think our marriage is?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "Look, I can't do this right now. We'll talk later." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my suspicions and a growing sense of dread. I sank back up onto the couch, my mind reeling. Scott hadn't denied it. He hadn't even tried to reassure me. And his reaction, it was all the confirmation I needed. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Frank. "Hey, sweetie, just checking in. Scott mentioned you weren't feeling well. Need anything?" I stared at the message, a plan forming in my mind. If Scott was going to lie to me, two could play at that game. "Actually," I typed back, my fingers shaking slightly, "I could use some company, and maybe some advice." As I hit send, I knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, my life and my marriage would never be the same. Frank arrived within the hour, his kind face etched with concern. I hadn't realized how desperately I needed a friendly presence until I saw him standing in my doorway. "Lena, sweetheart," he said, enveloping me in a warm hug. "What's going on?" I led him to the living room, my hands shaking as I poured us both a cup of tea. "Frank, I think Scott's cheating on me." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Frank's face went through a range of emotions, shock, disbelief, and then a slow, simmering anger. "What makes you think that?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. I told him everything, the late nights, the mysterious charges, the emails to Maggie. With each revelation, Frank's expression darkened. "I can't believe it," he muttered, shaking his head. "Scott, my own son." "There's more," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard him on the phone yesterday. He's planning a trip to the Pacific Islands. With you and Carol." Frank's brow furrowed. "What? We're not planning any trip." The realization hit us both at the same time. Scott was using his parents as a cover for a romantic getaway with his mistress. "Oh, Lena," Frank said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." I nodded, fighting back tears. "What do I do, Frank? I feel so lost." Before he could answer, the front door opened. Scott walked in, stopping short when he saw us. "Dad," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Frank stood up, his normally gentle demeanor replaced by something harder. "I think we need to have a talk, son." Scott's eyes darted between us, realization dawning. "Lena," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What have you been saying?" I stood up, my legs shaky, but my resolve firm. "Only the truth, Scott, something you seem to have forgotten how to tell." "You don't know what you're talking about," Scott snapped. "Dad, whatever she's told you." "Is it true?" Frank interrupted. "Are you having an affair?" The silence that followed was deafening. Scott's face went through a range of emotions, anger, guilt, defiance. "It's complicated," he finally said. Frank's disappointment was palpable. "I raised you better than this, Scott." "You don't understand," Scott argued. Lena's always sick, always needing something. I can't live like this anymore. His words cut through me like a knife. I stumbled back, gripping the couch for support. If that's how you feel, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, then maybe we shouldn't be married anymore. Scott's eyes widened. What? You heard me, I continued, a strange calm settling over me. I want a divorce. The room fell silent. Frank looked between us, his face a mixture of sadness and resolve. I think that might be for the best, he said quietly. Scott, I think you should leave, now. For a moment I thought Scott might argue, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. As soon as it closed behind him, my legs gave out. I sank onto the couch, my whole body shaking. Oh, sweetheart, Frank said, sitting next to me and pulling me into a hug. It's going to be okay. We'll get through this. I nodded against his shoulder, too overwhelmed to speak. As the reality of what had just happened washed over me, a strange mix of grief and relief flooded through me. My marriage was over. The life I had built with Scott was crumbling around me. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. As Frank held me, murmuring words of comfort, I made a silent vow to myself. No matter what happened next, I would survive this. I would rebuild my life, stronger and happier than before. And Scott? Well, he would soon learn that actions have consequences, and I had a feeling his were just beginning. The days following my confrontation with Scott blurred together in a haze of grief and determination. I'd moved into the spare bedroom, our interactions limited to tense, monosyllabic exchanges. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. With shaking hands, I logged into Scott's email account again. I knew it was wrong, but I needed answers. I needed proof. And there it was, staring me in the face. An email confirmation for 2 round-trip tickets to Bora Bora. Not in Scott's name, but in the name of his parents. My heart pounded as I read the dates. They matched perfectly with the business trip Scott had mentioned last week. I dug deeper, my stomach churning with each new discovery. There were dozens of emails between Scott and someone named Maggie. Sweet nothings, plans for their future, complaints about me. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. But it was the photos that broke me. Scott and a beautiful blonde woman wrapped in each other's arms on various beaches, in hotel rooms, at romantic restaurants. The timestamps showed a relationship spanning months, maybe even years. I barely made it to the bathroom before I was violently ill. Hours later, I sat on the cold tile floor, my back against the bathtub, when I heard the front door open. "Lena?" Scott called out. "Are you home?" I didn't answer. I couldn't find my voice. His footsteps approached the bathroom. "Lena, are you okay?" The concern in his voice made me want to scream. How dare he pretend to care now? I looked up as he appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of me. "Jesus, Lena, what happened?" "Maggie happened," I said, my voice hoarse. "Bora Bora happened. Your entire double life happened, Scott." The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Just don't. I've seen everything. The emails, the photos, the trip you booked under your parents' names. It's over, Scott. No more lies." He slumped against the doorframe, defeat written across his features. "Lena, Save it," I interrupted, forcing myself to stand. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want you out. Now." Scott's expression hardened. "You can't just kick me out. This is my house, too." "Is it?" I countered, a surge of anger giving me strength. "Because from what I've seen, you've been living a whole other life with Maggie. So go live it, but not here." He stepped towards me, his voice low and dangerous. "You're making a big mistake, Lena. You're sick. You need me." I stood my ground, even as my legs threatened to give out. "No, Scott. The biggest mistake I ever made was marrying you, and I'm not as helpless as you think." We stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Scott turned away. "Fine," he spat. "I'll go. But this isn't over." I watched as he stormed out, listening to the sounds of drawers being yanked open and clothes being thrown into bags. When the front door slammed shut, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Trembling, I made my way to the living room and picked up my phone. I had decisions to make, and I couldn't do it alone. "Frank?" I said when he answered. "I need your help. It's worse than we thought." As I filled Frank in on everything I'd discovered, a strange calm settled over me. The worst had happened. My marriage was over, my trust shattered. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something I'd almost forgotten: hope. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on. Scott and Maggie could have their fantasy life in Bora Bora. I was about to start a new chapter of my own, one where I called the shots. And God help anyone who tried to stand in my way. The shrill ring of my phone jolted me awake. I fumbled for it in the darkness, my heart racing. Late-night calls were never good news. "Hello?" I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Lena?" It was Frank, and he sounded devastated. "It's Beth. She's gone." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Beth, my mother-in-law, the woman who had been more of a mother to me than my own, was dead. I struggled to breathe, to comprehend. "What happened?" I managed to choke out. "Heart attack," Frank said, his voice breaking. "It was so sudden. We were just having dinner and—" I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. "I'll be right there, Frank. Just hold on." As I hung up, I realized with a start that Scott wasn't home. Of course he wasn't. He was probably with Maggie, blissfully unaware that his mother had just died. I dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I dialed Scott's number. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice trembling. "Scott, it's your mother. She's gone. Call me back immediately." The drive to Frank and Beth's house was a blur. When I arrived, the sight of the ambulance in the driveway made it all too real. Frank was sitting on the porch steps, looking lost and broken. I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around his shaking form. "Oh, Frank, I'm so sorry." He clung to me like a lifeline. "She was fine, Lena. We were laughing about something on TV and then she just collapsed." Over the next few hours, I handled everything. I spoke with the paramedics, called the funeral home, and tried Scott's phone countless times. Each unanswered call fueled a growing rage inside me. As dawn broke, I was sitting with Frank at the kitchen table, both of us clutching mugs of cold coffee, when my phone finally rang. It was Scott. "Lena? What's going on? I just got your messages." The casual tone of his voice made my blood boil. "Where the hell have you been?" I hissed, stepping outside so Frank wouldn't hear. "Your mother is dead, Scott. Dead, and you've been unreachable for hours." There was a long pause. "What? No, that can't be right." "It is right," I snapped. "She had a heart attack last night. Your father has been devastated, and I've been here alone, handling everything. Where are you?" I'm out of town," he stammered. "On business. I told you." "Save it," I interrupted. "I know exactly where you are and who you're with. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is that you get your ass back here immediately. Your father needs you." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with anger and grief. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of funeral arrangements and condolence calls. Scott returned, looking sheepish and guilty, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Not yet. Beth deserved better than that. The morning of the funeral dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the somber mood. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my black dress, a wave of determination washed over me. Beth had always encouraged me to stand up for myself, to be strong. She wouldn't have wanted me to live like this, in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. I looked at my reflection, really looked, for the first time in years. The woman staring back at me was tired, yes, but there was a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. In that moment, I made a decision. After the funeral, after we'd paid our respects to Beth, I would confront Scott. I would expose his lies, not just to him, but to everyone. It was time for the truth to come out. And I was ready to be the one to tell it. With one last deep breath, I turned away from the mirror and headed downstairs. I had a funeral to attend, a husband to confront, and a life to reclaim. Beth would have been proud. The church was packed, a sea of black-clad mourners paying their respects to Beth. I stood at the front next to Frank, my hand on his trembling shoulder. Scott was conspicuously absent. Just as the minister began to speak, the church doors burst open. Scott stumbled in, his suit rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. The congregation turned to stare as he made his way down the aisle. "Sorry I'm late," he mumbled, sliding into the pew next to me. The smell of alcohol on his breath made me recoil. Frank leaned over, his voice a harsh whisper. "Where the hell have you been?" Scott ignored him, his gaze fixed straight ahead. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time or place. But as the service continued, my resolve began to crumble. When it came time for Scott to deliver the eulogy, he stumbled to the podium. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't embarrass himself or dishonor Beth's memory. My mother, he began, his words slurring slightly, was a saint. She put up with so much from all of us, especially me. I saw Frank stiffen beside me. Scott continued, his voice growing louder. She always told me to be honest, to face my mistakes, so that's what I'm going to do now. My heart raced. Surely he wouldn't. I've been lying to everyone, Scott announced, his eyes wild. To my wife, to my father, to all of you, I've been having an affair? A collective gasp rippled through the church. Frank grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. Her name is Maggie, Scott continued, oblivious to the shock around him. And I love her. I'm sorry, Lena. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Mom. He stumbled back from the podium, nearly falling. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood up, my voice ringing out clear and strong. No, Scott, you don't get to do this. Not here. Not now. All eyes turned to me as I made my way to the front of the church. My legs were shaking, but my resolve was iron. Beth was a wonderful woman, I began, looking out at the stunned faces. She taught me about strength, about dignity, about standing up for myself. And that's what I'm doing now. I turned to face Scott, who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and fear. I've known about your affair for weeks, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I've seen the emails, the photos, the trip you planned to Bora Bora under your parents' names. While Beth was dying, while I was planning her funeral, you were with her. The church was dead silent. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, but I didn't care. Beth deserved better than this, I continued. She deserved a son who honored her, who lived up to the values she taught, and I deserve better too. I turned back to the congregation, my chin held high. I'm sorry you all had to witness this. Beth would have hated the drama, but she also would have wanted the truth to come out. So here it is. My marriage is over, and I'm finally okay with that. With those words, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I walked back to my seat, ignoring Scott's attempts to grab my arm. Frank stood up, his face a mask of fury. Get out, he said to Scott, his voice low and dangerous. Now. As Scott stumbled out of the church, leaving a wake of whispers behind him, I sat there, my heart pounding. I'd done it. I'd finally stood up for myself, for Beth, for the truth. The rest of the service passed in a blur. As we filed out of the church afterwards, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Frank. Beth would have been proud of you, he said, his eyes glistening with tears. I know I am. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As we walked out into the sunlight, I realized that this wasn't just the end of Beth's life. It was the end of my old life, too. And for the first time in years, I was ready to see what the future held. The weeks following Beth's funeral were a whirlwind of legal meetings, hushed phone calls, and sidelong glances from neighbors. I'd become the talk of the town, but for once, I didn't care. I was too busy reclaiming my life. I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the divorce papers. The door burst open, and Scott stormed in, his face flushed with anger. You can't do this to me, Lena, he snarled. You're ruining everything. I met his gaze steadily. No, Scott, you did that all on your own. My lawyer, a stern woman named Patricia, stood up. Mr. Thompson, you weren't invited to this meeting. I'll have to ask you to leave. Scott ignored her, his eyes wild. I've lost my job because of you. The firm says I'm a liability now. Do you have any idea what you've done? A twinge of satisfaction coursed through me. Actions have consequences, Scott. You made your choices. He slammed his fist on the desk, making me flinch. You vindictive bitch. You've turned everyone against me. Even my own father won't speak to me. Patricia reached for the phone. I'm calling security. Don't bother, I said, standing up. I'm leaving. We're done here anyway. As I walked out, Scott grabbed my arm. This isn't over, Lena. You'll regret this. I yanked my arm away, my voice low and dangerous. Touch me again, and you'll regret it. We're through, Scott. Accept it and move on. I left him standing there, shaking with rage. As I drove home, my phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and family, all expressing their support. But one message made me pause. It was from Maggie. We need to talk. Meet me at the park, 3 p.m. My heart raced. What could she possibly want? Against my better judgment, I found myself driving to the park at the appointed time. Maggie was sitting on a bench, her perfect blonde hair windswept, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up as I approached. Lena, she said, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry for everything. I sat down beside her, keeping my distance. Why did you want to meet? She took a deep breath. Scott? He's not who we thought he was. He's been lying to both of us. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? He never intended to leave you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was just using me. And now I'm pregnant. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the bench, trying to steady myself. Does he know? I managed to ask. Maggie nodded, tears streaming down her face. He told me to get rid of it, said it would ruin everything. When I refused, he threatened me. A cold fury washed over me. That bastard, I hissed. I didn't know where else to turn, Maggie said, her voice breaking. You're the only one who understands what he's really like. In that moment, looking at this broken woman who had once been my rival, I made a decision that would change everything. Listen to me, Maggie, I said, taking her hand. We're going to get through this, together. Her eyes widened in surprise. You'd help me? After everything? I nodded, a grim smile on my face. Scott hurt us both. It's time we fought back. As we sat there, two unlikely allies united against a common enemy, I felt a surge of determination. Scott thought he could manipulate and threaten his way out of this mess. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I pulled out my phone, dialing a familiar number. Frank, it's Lena. We need to talk. It's about Scott, and it's worse than we thought. As I hung up, I turned to Maggie. Are you ready for this? She nodded, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Let's take him down. In that moment, I knew we were on the brink of something big. The final battle was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't going to lose. 5 years. It's been 5 years since that day in the park with Maggie. 5 years since we decided to take a stand against Scott. And what a journey it's been. I sit on my porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset. The sound of laughter drifts from inside the house, Jake playing with Maggie's daughter, Emma. It's a sound that never fails to warm my heart. The doorbell rings, and I know who it is before I even answer. Frank, his hair now completely gray, but his eyes as kind as ever, stands on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers. Happy birthday, Lena, he says, pulling me into a hug. As we settle in the living room, Jake joins us, Emma perched on his hip. The sight of them together still amazes me sometimes. After everything that happened with Scott, I never thought I'd trust again, let alone find love. But Jake, he's different. He understands my health struggles, supports me through the bad days, and celebrates the good ones. So, Frank says, a mischievous glint in his eye, have you heard the latest about Scott? I shake my head. After the dust settled from our legal battle, where Maggie and I exposed not just his infidelity, but his financial fraud and threats, I'd made a point of not keeping tabs on my ex-husband. Apparently, he's working as a night janitor at his old firm, Frank chuckles. Quite a fall from grace for the former hotshot lawyer. Part of me wants to feel satisfied to revel in Scott's downfall, but mostly I just feel nothing. The anger, the hurt, the desire for revenge, it's all faded away, replaced by a peace I never thought I'd find. You know, I say, bouncing Emma on my knee, I almost feel sorry for him. Jake raises an eyebrow. Really? After everything he put you through? I nod slowly. Don't get me wrong, he deserves the consequences of his actions, but living with that much bitterness and regret, it must be exhausting. Frank reaches out and squeezes my hand. Beth would be so proud of you, Lena. You've grown so much. His words bring tears to my eyes. Beth had always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I like to think she's watching over us, smiling at the family we've created. As the evening wears on, filled with laughter and love, I find myself reflecting on the journey that brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the fight to reclaim my life, it all led to this moment. Later, as Jake and I get ready for bed, he wraps his arms around me from behind, meeting my eyes in the mirror. You okay? He asks softly. You seemed lost in thought earlier. I turn in his arms, resting my head on his chest. I was just thinking about how far I've come, how different my life is now. He kisses the top of my head. You're the strongest person I know, Lena. You took a horrible situation and turned it into something beautiful. As we climb into bed, I feel a sense of contentment wash over me. My health may still have its ups and downs, but I'm no longer defined by my illness or by what Scott did to me. I'm defined by my resilience, by the love I give and receive, by the family I've chosen. I think about Maggie and Emma. living in their own apartment nearby, building a life free from Scott's shadow. I think about Frank, who became more of a father to me than ever before. And I think about Jake, who loves me unconditionally, who sees my strength even on my weakest days. As I drift off to sleep, I realize something profound. The revenge I once craved, the justice I fought so hard for, it wasn't about making Scott suffer. It was about reclaiming my own power, about proving to myself that I could overcome anything. And I did. I survived. I thrived. And now, surrounded by love and peace, I can finally say I won, not because Scott lost, but because I found myself. And that, more than anything, is the sweetest victory of all.